Hello and thank you for watching the Angry Rooster Creations channel. Today we are taking a look at another fountain pen ink. This is a specialty ink. This is Noodler's Manjiro Nakahama Whaleman Sepia ink. From this point forward in the writing, I'm going to, generally speaking for the rest of the video, just refer to this as Whaleman Sepia because I don't want to run the risk of repeatedly butchering the name and pronunciation of this ink. But this is sort of a specialty ink that I believe is a Goulet Pens exclusive. It is a, as the name suggests, it's a sepia toned ink. It's kind of a, it's kind of an odd one though, because when you write with this ink, it goes down on the paper brown, but as it begins to dry, it turns into this very peculiar gray-ish color. It's a hard one to describe, and it's probably going to be hard to show on video. But in this video, I'm going to do a test on 5 different papers. Now, they're not necessarily the kinds of papers you usually see in videos like this. I mostly use my pens for art and drawing purposes, so most of the papers that I have, the decent papers, are art papers more than, like, say, journaling and notebooking papers. I'm going to be using as sort of controls for less than ideal surfaces. I've got a 20-pound Pen Gear copy paper from Walmart. I've got a Pen Gear composition notebook. I've got a 50-pound white sulfite drawing paper from Blick. I've got a 50-pound Koh-i-Noor sketch paper, and the last paper will be a 98-pound Canson mixed media paper. And then I've got a chromatography that I'm going to show that I did after those writing samples, and then I'm going to do a very quick water test as well as, and then kind of give my sort of concluding thoughts on this particular ink. So without further ado, let's move on to those writing samples. And now for our writing sample. This first writing sample is the 20-pound copy paper. The pen for this video is going to be this Hongdian 1861 Black Forest Pro in brass, and it has an extra fine nib. All right. Alright, so they're sort of got our writing sample done here. I don't know how well all of this is going to show up on the paper. There is some feathering on this copy paper, but not really to an absurd degree. This is kind of what I would generally expect from most fountain pen inks. You really have to be quite close to see the feathering. Maybe, perhaps, if I can get that. See, I have to adjust my lighting here. If you can see the feathering on that F and EF there, is probably the most egregious. And actually, yeah, both of those EFs, you can probably see the feathering there. But like I said, it's not really feathering worse than any of the, what I would normally expect from a fountain pen ink on, a lot of inks, excuse me, on copy paper. This is one of the worst papers you can use, after all. Looks like the smear started, looks like there might have been a little bit of smearing starting at the 4th hash mark there, so that's still wet on this paper to a certain degree after about 6 seconds. From what I know about this ink does tend to have a longer dry time than other inks. And you can see, well, I don't know, you might not be able to see, but if it shows up here, there's actually a bit of, let me get a little bit more light on here, there's a bit of actual shading you can see on that scrub. Now, in the actual writing on this paper, I might can see some hints of shading. This is one that, as we move on to some of the less absorbent papers, we might end up seeing some shading. Now, keep in mind, this is a extra fine nib, so I expect that to be a minimum. And on the back here, yeah, we got some bleed through. You can kind of see a little bit. There's some bleed in some spots. And quite a bit of ghosting. Now, I probably would not use this ink if I was suspecting that I would be needing to write on both sides of a piece of copy paper. I mean, just in general, this is probably not the paper I would choose to write on copy paper with, but if I had to, I would only really use it in an application where I had to write on one side. Because if you have to write on both sides, it might start giving you some issues there. So all in all, definitely not the worst I've seen on copy paper, but not the best either. So our next writing sample is going to be in the composition notebook. And now we have the Pen Gear composition notebook. This is about the cheapest composition notebook you can get at Walmart. All right. All right. So that's got us finished with the notebook here. Now, I will say, on this notebook paper, I see a lot less feathering than, well, actually, I don't really see any feathering, to be honest, myself, here on this paper. And actually, and that's not spreading or growing on the page for what I can see. And actually, on this front side of the page, doesn't look too bad. Now, once again, I will say you can probably see it there. There appears to be maybe some shading in the scrub. Of course, that could be just the smear versus the lines. There might be some hints of shading in the ink itself, in the writing, actually. I think I can see, I don't know if that's going to come through, like on the H there in Hong Dien, the print H, not the cursive H. I can see parts of the legs of those letters that are of different shades. It's kind of barely coming through, though. I think maybe if you used a broader nib, you might see some shading with this ink, but once again, it's just that dark gray-brown color. And you can see that it's like the lines are gray, but where the smear is definitely that kind of brown color. Now, on this, you'll see all 10 lines, so that's 10 seconds. This ink is still wet after 10 seconds on notebook paper. And you can see that in the scrub and smear too. So, like I said, this is definitely not a very fast drying ink, and I think on some papers it can be quite a long time drying ink. Now, this is kind of interesting from what I'm seeing here. I can't quite tell. No, that's not from this, because I had some brown over here on my scratch sheet, but there's nowhere really where there's any signs that it bled through this notebook paper. And except for maybe there's a little spot there on the scrub, you can see that this ink, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't really even say that it's ghosting here. I mean, you can see it through on the paper because you've got a white, obviously white paper behind it, and it's a dark ink. But honestly, if you were writing in a notebook with this paper, you could use both sides of the page with, or I said writing a notebook with this paper. Writing in a notebook with this ink, you could use both sides of the page just fine. The only thing I would say, like I said, it has a longer dry time. You would want to make sure that the ink was dry before you turn the page, or you could be pressing wet ink onto the opposing page. But as far as bleed through and ghosting, The back side of this is perfectly usable. The only place where it seems like it wanted to is on the scrub, but that's not something you're actually going to be doing if you're trying to write in a notebook like this. So I would say for notebook use, like I said, just don't turn the page until you know for a fact you're dry. Other than that, writing on a notebook, perfectly doable. Our next writing sample is going to be on the 50-pound Blick white sulfite drawing paper. And here is the 50-pound Blick white sulfite drawing paper. Alright. So here we are on the Blick white sulfite drawing paper. I can tell you, yep, actually, it was still wet. I thought so. I couldn't tell if that was shading or if it was wet. I don't know if you can see I got that dot to smear. So, and it was actually quite a while since I wrote that top line. So certainly you can see at the end of the stroke. Now the whole line is not still wet. It's just where the dots are at the end of the strokes and places where the pen ended on a line stroke, or where I dotted the paper where it dropped some more ink. The ink is still wet. Like I said, this ink has a bit of a longer dry time. But on this paper, there is no feathering or ghosting, or excuse me, ghosting would be on the back, but no feathering or spreading of the ink on seen from the top of this paper. Now you will, I see, I don't know if that's going to show up on that 1861 there. I see some shading. Where it's lighter on the line, it's more brown. Where it's darker on the line is that sort of darker gray sort of look to it. So there is color, some shade and color variation here. Like I said, I suspect that if you were using a broader nib, you would see more with this ink. And like I said, it's a pretty interesting color. I don't know if you can tell by looking on the camera here the kind of hue difference between the black. It's a real interesting color. But overall, it performed fine. Like I said, just it's a little bit of a, okay, it's dry now. Well, got that dot to smear on Whaleman's there. So it does have that longer dry time. Now on the back of this, it did not bleed through this paper and didn't ghost or really show through it all. Now, like I said, this is a 50-pound drawing paper. You can see this is from the Heart of Darkness ink that I tested in a previous video. This is, of the art papers I have, this is the most absorbent that I'm going to be showing. It is technically the least ink friendly. I think this paper is really meant a little bit more for dry media than wet media. You can do it with certain inks, but it's not the perfect it's not the perfect paper for that. In fact, this stuff is very economical. I think it's meant more for classroom use. It's sold by the ream, so 500 sheets for a lot cheaper than the other papers that I'm about to show. So keep that in mind. This isn't the best of best papers for ink, but, and I've had some of the inks that I've tested on it not do the greatest on this paper, but this ink is just fine on this paper. It's not a problem. You don't have to worry about it spreading, feathering, doing funky things, or bleeding. Just, once again, noting that this ink has a longer dry time. Alright, and our next paper is going to be the 50-pound Koh-i-Noor sketch paper. And now here we are with the 50-pound Koh-i-Noor sketch paper. Alright, and there is the 50-pound Koh-i-Noor sketch paper. As you can see, once again, there is with this paper. Now this paper is even less absorbent than the last paper that I showed. This paper is, there's no, you can see I accidentally smeared my writing there. I don't know when I smeared that, because I don't have any ink that I can see on the bottom of my hand, so I wonder if somehow when I was brushing the smear test, if I smeared across and somehow hit this. I'm not entirely sure. But you can see on that EF, I did smear that at some point during this writing sample. I can tell by looking at this, it may not show on the camera, I don't know if it's going to show any sheen on any of these dots, but where I dotted some eyes and where I've got the ends of some strokes, like I could tell on the bottom of both of those 1861s. And on this E and F, the cursive E and F, not the one I smeared, I can tell they're still wet. Well, prove me, no, it's still a little bit. Not much, but just a little bit. That was still a little wet. And that eye right there, yep. I was able to smear that eye. So, like I said, this is not a very absorbent paper. So generally speaking, compared to the other papers I've used, every ink I've tested on this paper takes longer to dry because it sits on the paper rather than soak into the paper. But also, this is a longer dry time on this ink. Now, there is one thing I would like to note. I have never had any problems with this pen, even though this isn't extra fine, with flow and keeping up with this particular ink. But from what I've read and heard and kind of seen from other people is this ink tends to write dry in a lot of pens, and some pens just will not flow this ink at all. And the reason I want to say that is while this is still wet, I want you to look at how little ink is here. Now obviously this was two different pens, but they were both extra fines that I used for both of these writing samples. This is the Noodler's Heart of Darkness, and you can see just how much more ink was on the paper with an extra fine versus this Whaleman Sepia. So, like I said, I haven't experienced any issues with this particular extra fine nib and this particular pen keeping up with this ink, but I have heard some anecdotal things and seen some things from other people who have used this ink that it is very dry and in some pens doesn't necessarily want to flow. But that being said, I've only really had experience with it in this pen and another pen I had tested it in before I got this pen. And so, you know, that is something I would like to note here. So while you are seeing that the smear seems to be, you know, there doesn't seem to be a terrible amount of smear here. It's not so much that it had necessarily dried quickly and then where the blobs were sitting didn't you know, dry where there was more ink on the page. It's a matter of this ink does go down a little drier. Because, see, the scrub here, you can tell, that's pretty much an immediate, I do the scrub and I smear it. When you compare that with something like the Heart of Darkness up here on this paper, you can see there was much more ink on the paper. Like I said, both of these were extra fine nibs. They're extra fines from different manufacturers, but they're extra fines with similar line weights. So, you know, that is something to note, and I think that's also potentially why I am with this ink seeing some shading, because I am getting some shading here. I don't know how well this is going to show up. But like at the end of that R on the cursive Noodlers there, the top of that W on Whaleman's, the I and the S here on Whaleman's, like there is shading here. Like I said, it's a pretty dark ink, so it isn't, you know, from a distance you may not see it, but getting close onto this paper, I am seeing shading some. Like I said, if you were using this in a more broad nib, a wetter flowing nib, you might see more of that or less. I'm not entirely sure. If it was wetter flowing and laid a lot of ink down on the paper, it might actually darken up all the writing to the point it might actually kind of negate some of that shading that we're seeing here. It might be just because the ink's going down drier so that the end of that stroke where it drops more ink on the paper, you get the shade. Now on the back of this, there's really nothing coming through. I didn't expect it. There's no ghosting, no bleeding, no anything. This is a 50-pound paper. That being said, it's a very thin for a 50-pound paper. It's just the formulation of this paper is not at all absorbent. So I have yet to really have any ink that bled through this. Even the most aggressive inks I've tested have not bled through this paper right here. So, and based on how this one hasn't so far been the most aggressive ink on the other 3 papers that we've tested, I didn't expect to see anything on this one. And so next is going to be our last paper, which is the Canson 98-pound mixed media paper. And so for our final writing test here, we have the Canson 98-pound mixed media paper. All right, and that's got us taken care of on finished on the Canson mixed media. Now I can tell here, this is probably going to be the best surface. This has consistently been the best surface for writing on inks that I have tested in my ink test videos. Pretty much any ink, no matter how temperamental it is, has written just fine on this paper right here. This mixed media paper is generally supposed to be, like the name suggests, mixed media. It's for wet media, dry media. You can do a little bit of everything on it. It's not necessarily the best for everything. Like, this isn't perfect for watercolor paper. That being said, you can do watercolors on this paper, or alcohol markers, or these types of fountain pen inks, or India inks, Chinese ink, you know, pretty much whatever you want to on this paper. And as far as ink, this paper has consistently been my best fountain pen performing paper, period. But, you know, it is a very specific art paper. Now, onto this, there is no feathering or growing. Like I said, you're going to see the most well-behaved lines, and we do. Now, I can tell that some of this writing is still wet on this paper because it is not absorbent really at all. And that's kind of by design. Now, it's not as, you know, slick and unabsorbent as, say, for instance, a smooth Bristol would be. I haven't really tested any of my fountain pen inks on Bristol. I might make a video at some point doing that, but what little bit I have written or drawn with fountain pen inks on Bristol takes a very long time for fountain pen inks to dry on Bristol, in my experience. In some cases, I feel like even India ink, in some cases, depending on how wet you put it on the page, can actually dry faster than some fountain pen inks, and that's saying a lot. So I usually don't use fountain pen inks on Bristol myself, but that's a side tangent. This seems to be very, very, very well behaved. Now, obviously, you can still see 10 seconds, the smear, it was wet. The scrub, it was wet. I think still, yep, I was able to smear that dot on Whaleman's. So this has been, shoot, probably over 30 seconds. No, more than that. Probably almost a minute since I wrote that, and it's still wet. So like I said, this ink has a longer dry time than almost any other ink that I think I have tried. Except for maybe Noodler's X Feather. I have tried Noodler's X Feather one time, and that has a very long dry time. I'm not sure which of these two, between this and X Feather, has a longer dry time, but both are pretty out there. But it looks fine. Like I said, I can, once again, getting it very close here in the light, I can definitely see shading with this ink. And yeah, it performs just fine. Now, there's not going to be any bleed through. I have not had any inks to bleed through this at all. This mixed media paper, not only is it not absorbent, it's 98 pounds. And I don't know if you can hear right there, this is about as thick as cardstock. So I have yet to have any fountain pen ink, even on the heaviest scrubs, bleed through this. I'm even pretty certain that you could take a brush and brush a lot of inks on this and they would not bleed through this paper. But, you know, I would say this ink, and pretty much every ink I put on this paper, to be honest, has passed with flying colors. If you want to know what an ink looks like at peak performance, this is kind of a paper to draw on. Even, like I said, if it's an extremely temperamental ink, it will write and look good on this particular paper. So that's got all of our writing tests finished and out of the way. Now, real quick, I want to go over and show this this little poor man's chromatography that I did. This, like I said, this is a poor man's chromatography. This is a piece of paper towel, which obviously isn't the most ideal type of filter paper. You can, as you can see, do a chromatography on paper towel, but there are better papers. I just don't have access to them or didn't have them on hand. So this was, I put a line of ink down here, and then I put it immediately into a mixture of a roughly 70-30 mix of water and isopropyl alcohol. And here's what you can see. Now, you can see the dark blotch at the bottom, which is kind of that almost burgundy, maybe even slightly a purple look. I don't know how it's going to show up on camera, but it's kind of a burgundy-ish purple look. And then here in the middle, you've got sort of almost a yellow-greenish, and then a kind of gray band here. So there's at least two color bands right there. I don't know how that's, like a greenish kind of yellow, a sort of dark gray, maybe with a hint of blue. It's hard to tell. And then once you get up to the top, you've got kind of this sort of red-orange color at the top. Now, I haven't played around with throwing bleach on this ink, but you can actually, there's some videos and stuff and things you can read up about Nathan Tardif's thought process that he went through when he designed this ink and some of the components in it. But if you put bleach on this ink, it will actually go from that sepia color to a red. And then apparently if you put an even stronger bleach solution, it will cause it to somehow turn purple. I have not played around with that at all, but that goes into something to do with the formulation of this ink. So when you see all kinds of these crazy colors here, like I said, if you have a better filter paper, you might actually see more than I'm seeing here on my poor man's paper towel chromatography. But you know, you can see there is quite a bit of different component parts to this ink. So like I said, not necessarily the best chromatography, but for what it's worth, here it is. And now I'm going to move on to doing a very quick water resistance test. Alright, now here's going to be our quick little water resistance test. This is a little piece of 20-pound copy paper. Now, what I'm going to do here is write on this and do a little kind of grid on here. I'm going to leave it for 30 seconds. Then I'm going to take this pipette. I'm going to drip water on it. Let it stand for 10 seconds, rub it in, and then dab it off with a paper towel. And we're going to see what lifts onto the paper towel and what potentially runs on the page. All right. All right. I can't really tell. I feel like I can maybe see, I don't know if it's going to show on the paper. There, it looks like there's a brown line here. I feel like I can see a little bit of a brown that has lifted here. On the paper itself, I don't really see too much evidence that it moved. Now, because of the dry time on this ink, on some of the papers I've tested, clearly after 30 seconds, there was still some wet ink on like end spots on dots like this. Now this being the copy paper and it being more absorbent, the dry time wasn't quite as long on the copy paper, so that's one thing to consider. If you have a less absorbent paper, it's not going to be water resistant this quickly. But from other tests I have seen, this does seem to be water resistant, so long as it has been given sufficient time to dry on the page. But even this, with just 30 seconds to dry and then exposing it to water on copy paper where it absorbs into the paper, it does appear to be quite water resistant, because that paper is thoroughly saturated, and I really kind of rubbed it in almost to the point, if I'd have rubbed much more, I probably would have started actually breaking the paper down. But like I said, I don't know if that's going to show. There is a little bit of brown here, which I kind of expected to see that. So all in all, it appears to be fairly water resistant. Now, I'm going to kind of go over my final thoughts on this ink in particular. So this ink, like I said, I believe this is a Goulet Pens exclusive, and it is only available in the 4.5 ounce bottle. Now, it looks like I have used a whole lot. I don't know how well this is going to show up. Well, the ink's sticking to the side of the bottle. I actually got a different ink bottle. I have a diamine ink bottle that I filled with this, because obviously it's hard to, you can't really put a cartridge converter pen down inside this 4.5 ounce bottle and fill it. So I have more of that ink. I rebottled it to make it easier to fill the pen when I need to. Now, I actually got some random ink samples in a Goulet Pens order. I think I got I can't remember if it was like a sale or something where you got 5 ink samples. They were either on sale for really cheap, like 5 random ink samples, or it was free over a certain thing with some kind of a sales promotion. I can't remember. But whatever it was, I got one of those. And I was sent a sample bottle, a little sample bottle of the Whaleman Sepia. Well, I was going to look for it, but it'd take me a minute to find it. No, we'll just forget it. But, it was kind of one of these little things. And I saw it, I saw that Whaleman Sepia, and I was like, what is this ink? I've never heard of this ink. And I tried it out, and I really liked it. Now, what really kind of sold me on that ink was I had found this little book at Walmart. It's this little 200 drawing prompts book, and it didn't really have ink-friendly paper. But for some reason, even though the one sketch that I did in here with the Heart of Darkness ink, which I usually ink with, feathered real bad, I took that sample vial, that sampled Whaleman Sepia, and wrote on this paper, and it actually handled it quite well. Now hold on a second, let me see if I can pull up some of the pictures that I've done in here. So, this ink, I don't know how well this is going to show up with this color. I do have some scans of these. I'm going to try and put in here some actual photo scans of these pictures. But this paper is not a white paper. It's kind of an ivory colored paper. And on ivory colored paper, this ink looks so good. On white paper, it kind of looks off, but if you have an off-white paper that you can write on, or you have like a journal that has kind of a cream-colored paper, this looks so good. And here's a color combo I really like. This is the Noodler's Polar Green that I've done a video on before. On here with this Whaleman Sepia, and it's just it's a, like I said, it's very paper specific, but if you've got an off-white paper, or not a bright white paper to draw on with this ink or write on, it just really changes, and it kind of works with that whole sepia tone. So for artistic purposes, I can understand why somebody would not choose this ink for a daily writing ink, but for artistic purposes, I really like this ink. And that's one of the reasons why I'm kind of interested to see what happens with the next test I'm going to be doing with this ink. And generally several of the inks, I've got 7 inks I'm going to end up putting on the papers that I wrote on. So if anybody's watched any of my other ink test videos that I did, the last 7 inks that I did, which was a lot of polar inks and things, I did a light test where I took the papers from my ink test, taped them up in a window, and left them for a month facing out on the south side of my house, so they were in direct sunlight for a month, during the day, to test the light fastness of those inks. And I'm going to do it again this time around. And this Whaleman Sepia is one that I really want to see what the light fastness is on this ink. I'm hoping that this ink doesn't fade when it's exposed to light, because I really like drawing with this ink, but I haven't actually done any finished pieces that I've framed or put out somewhere, because I'm not entirely sure confirmed whether or not this is really a light fast ink. I know it's a water resistant ink and is considered to be a more permanent ink, but even some of the inks that I've seen that are water resistant, take for instance the Bay State ink in my last light test, almost completely disappeared in that light test. Like, there was almost no trace of that Bay State Concord grape, yet when you drip water on it, the pink part of that ink moves out, but the blue was seemingly water resistant. So I'm hoping in this light fastness test that's coming up, this one will pass it with flying colors, so I will actually do it more art with this. But as of right now, I've kind of just left it to sketchbook art and stuff that won't be displayed. But having all that been said, like I said, I really like this ink for my particular use of it. And like I said, with this particular Hongdian Black Forest pen, even though this isn't extra fine, and this is kind of from what I've heard from other people, is that this tends to be a pretty dry writing ink in a lot of pens, to the point that some pens won't use it. I have not had issues with it in this pen. This pen has passed, handled this ink perfectly well. And just to be completely honest, I bought this pen specifically because I wanted a brass pen to put this ink in. Just because, that kind of the nautical theme, the sepia tone, that kind of, especially when drawing on those kind of cream and off-white colored papers, it's kind of a, I don't know, a stylistic ambiance thing, or not ambiance, but it's kind of a vibe, I guess you could say. It feels kind of cringy using that term, but it made me, I was like, oh, this would be an awesome ink to have in a brass pen. So I went out of my way to actually purchase this pen, specifically looking for a brass pen. That's kind of how, how much I sort of kind of fell in love with this ink when I started drawing with it. Now, I will say this, another thing, like I said, this is only available in a 4.5 ounce bottle, but also, I believe this is one of the more expensive, if not maybe the, I don't know, I can't say it's the most expensive Noodler's ink, but compared to, say, like your 4.5 ounce bottle of Heart of Darkness here, this ink is about $13.50 more for the 14.5 or the 4.5 ounce bottle here than, say, like Heart of Darkness or pretty much any of the other 4.5 ounce bottle inks. So it is a pricier ink. I would assume maybe it's done in sort of limited batch runs, and it's only a batch of this is done whenever Goulet runs out, because like I said, I think this is specifically a Goulet Pens exclusive ink. So, limited availability, higher cost, and so those things also probably go into consideration with this particular ink. So with that having all been said, that kind of concludes my video on this ink. If you watched this long in the video, I thank you for watching. And if you got any useful information from it, you thought I did a pretty decent job, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up. That'd really help me out. If you have any questions about the ink or anything you saw in the video, you have any comments or criticisms, critiques about the way that I conducted my testing and things, you can drop those down there too. All of those kinds of comments, those questions, suggestions, that's all helpful, helps me to, do a better job with making my videos and trying to understand what people want to see and what's more helpful to the viewers too. And also, if you watch this video, maybe you watch some of my other videos, you kind of, you think I'm doing a pretty good job, you want to see more, I would also appreciate a subscription. That would also help me out. So with all that being said, I thank you for watching, and I hope to catch you on the next one. Bye.